Hello, my name is Constancia Mushoto. I'm a researcher at the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research in the Natural Resources and the Environmental Unit. The focus of my work is on applying transdisciplinary approaches to the management of the agriculture-environment interface for purposes of sustaining agricultural production while maintaining the integrity of the natural resource base. The focus of this presentation is the stakeholder workshop that each of the country teams will have to hold. And in this presentation, we'll look at the purpose of the first stakeholder engagement workshop, conceptualize that workshop, and later coordinate it, and how to get the right group of people together to do the visioning, identification of constraints and problems, and later identification of the broad objectives of the research. We'll also look at how to obtain useful information from the workshop, information then that will then feed into the transdisciplinary research process. And finally, identify the steps that should follow the workshop in terms of getting the transdisciplinary process going. The focus of the first stakeholder workshop should be on engaging the right people in the right way, and this should be based on the principles of integrated water resources management. IWRM promotes coordinated development and management of land, water, and related resources. And this then means that whoever participates in the stakeholder workshop or in IWRM research projects has to do so in an organized manner. In an organized and orderly manner. And IWRM seeks to maximize economic, social, and social welfare in an equitable manner. This then means that economic interests, social interests, and environmental interests have to be represented in IWRM, and these interests also have to be represented in the first stakeholder workshop. In preparing for the first stakeholder workshop, it should be remembered that the research has to be conducted in a transparent, legal, and legitimate way. So it is important to think about the requirements in the context of each country and each institution that is participating in this IWRM research. Are there research ethics that need to be considered, for instance, at an institutional level, at a country level? Are there applications that need to be lodged or evidence presented to show that ethical consideration will be taken on board? Is there special permission that has to be obtained before the workshop is held and even before individual interviews are held? So it means that country teams have to take these factors into consideration and put in place the necessary applications if required and fulfill the necessary conditions. And the second part is looking at the key stakeholders. Who are the key stakeholders who should be invited to the workshop? The process of identifying these key stakeholders has already begun with the process of compiling the research proposal, because in compiling the research proposal, the participants in the research and the beneficiaries have been identified, and these are part of the stakeholder group. And the literature review that the different country teams have undertaken in compiling the research process, the research proposals, has also informed them about the potential stakeholders, and the researchers' knowledge of the case study area also informed them about who these potential stakeholders are. However, the lists that the different country teams have of stakeholders are not comprehensive enough. It means then that they have to be added onto. So this process of thinking through who the key stakeholders are should happen, and then the lists have to be augmented. Stakeholders can be defined as people, and these can be individuals, groups, or institutions with interests in a project or a program, and this would include both people that could be considered as winners and losers as a result of a project. If we think in terms of winners and losers, and use a specific example, for instance, in the context of integrated water resources management, If an irrigation scheme were to be set up, there would be people that would need to give up their land to make way for that scheme. And this could be considered to be the losers in the context of that particular project. But then there would be people who would gain irrigation plots as a result of the establishment of that irrigation scheme. And this could be considered to be winners in that context. And both winners and losers would be stakeholders in a project. And stakeholders can also be considered to be people who have power or influence over a project, some kind of interest in its success or even in its failure. And to deal effectively with stakeholders, it is necessary to understand them. And one way of understanding stakeholders is through a two-fold stakeholder analysis. Stakeholder analysis is essentially the identification of a project's key stakeholders, assessment of their interests and ways in which these interests affect a project in terms of riskiness and viability, whether that project would succeed or fail. The whole concept behind stakeholder analysis is enabling people to identify, or project leaders or project teams to be able to identify who their stakeholders in the context of a particular project are, and to be able to prioritize those stakeholders. And that would just be a process of working out the power that they have over a project, the influence that they could have over a project, and their interest. And then this helps the research team to identify who to focus on in terms of their stakeholder engagement process. And this understanding of the power and influence that stakeholders have over a project can be done through mapping on a power interest matrix. And sometimes the words importance and influence are used in place of power and interest. And this power means power over the project and interest in the project, essentially. This is an example of a power interest matrix for stakeholder prioritization or stakeholder analysis. On the x-axis, we have interest, and on the y-axis, we have power. Interest increases from the left to the right, while power increases from the bottom of the matrix to the top of the page. In the top right-hand quadrant, we have high power, high interest stakeholders. And in the top left-hand quadrant, we have high power, low interest stakeholders, while the bottom left-hand quadrant has low power, low interest stakeholders, and the low power, high interest stakeholders in the bottom right-hand quadrant. For the high power, high interest stakeholders, these are the most important stakeholders in a project, and it is crucial to engage closely with this group. And in terms of stakeholder engagement efforts, the greatest effort should go towards building good relationships with this group. And if we take an example of an integrated water resources management project, for instance, a water and sanitation project in a country, the Department of Health, for instance, and Department of Water Affairs would qualify as the high power, high interest stakeholders in the context of such a project. While the high power, low interest group of stakeholders are a group that needs to be kept satisfied, but they don't need to be provided with as much information as the high power, high interest group. And it is important also to watch out not to bore this group with too much information. The low power, high interest group of stakeholders should be kept adequately informed about a project, and this group could actually be helpful with providing detail. And this group also has the potential sometimes to oppose a project. The low power, low interest group of stakeholders represent a group where too much effort shouldn't be expended in terms of engagement with them and keeping them informed. It is, however, important to provide them with some information and not to ignore them completely. After going through the process of understanding the power and influence that potential stakeholders have on a project, it is necessary to go ahead and do an analysis, a short analysis on, so as to better understand these key stakeholders. For instance, how are they likely to feel and react to the project? What kind of interest do they have in the project? Is it a financial interest? Is it an emotional interest? And is that interest negative or positive? What kind of information would those stakeholders want from the project? And in what form would they want to receive that information? And how should information be communicated? For example, one might think of using a newsletter as a way of communicating with a group of stakeholders. But if literacy levels, for instance, are low in that group of stakeholders, it then means that a newsletter is not an appropriate way of disseminating information. And the project would have to work out appropriate ways of reaching stakeholders, and different groups might actually require to be communicated with in a different way. And what is the best way of communicating? And one also needs to understand what stakeholders' current opinion of the project is. And in order to understand key stakeholders, it is important to talk to the stakeholders directly so as to get a feel for where they are in terms of the project. It should also be remembered that some stakeholders have power to undermine a project, while others may be strong supporters of a project. And stakeholder engagement and the techniques that are used should take these factors into consideration. And then stakeholders then need to be engaged appropriately. What then is the value of a process of stakeholder analysis? Stakeholder analysis, if conducted properly, can provide an indication of whose opinions to weigh heaviest in a project. For instance, in the analysis, we found that we have high power, high interest stakeholders. And these would, for instance, be the group of stakeholders whose opinion should weigh heaviest in a project. And stakeholder analysis can also provide an indication of who to consult first in making major decisions in a project. And it can also provide an indication of the risks to a project and its potential viability, and can also be used to determine the best way to engage and communicate with project stakeholders. And by conducting a proper stakeholder analysis, one can get a sense of the possible areas of conflict in a project. It is important also to be able to identify relationships between stakeholders, because the interaction is not only limited to stakeholders in the project research team, but there are relationships between stakeholders, and these need to be managed to the benefit of the project. And the stakeholder analysis can also be used to work out methods needed to consult each stakeholder group adequately. And then it can also be used to develop a strategy for stakeholder participation and engagement in a project. In planning the actual stakeholder involvement in a project, it is necessary to take cognizance of the interests, importance, and influence of each stakeholder group and to engage them appropriately. In particular, efforts are needed to involve the powerful stakeholders who lack interest, because this group could potentially derail a project. And appropriate forms of participation are needed throughout the project cycle. And these forms of participation in the strategy for engagement could change as the project evolves. And the extent of stakeholder engagement will be highly influenced by the project objectives, the resources available to the project, and the time. And the stakeholder involvement or engagement should be realistic and cognizant of the resource limitations that a project faces. Going back to preparing for the first stakeholder workshop, it is important to engage with the selected stakeholders. These are the stakeholders that have been identified and listed. And this should be done on an individual basis. Telephone calls can be made to those stakeholders. Meetings can be held to explain the project to them. And it is necessary also to confirm the final list of stakeholders to be invited to the workshop. And this could be based on recommendations from the key stakeholder group on who should actually be invited. And it is necessary also to ensure attendance by the selected key stakeholders. And it is important to send timely invitations, to send invitations early so that stakeholders are able to plan and come to the workshop. And it is a good idea not to send invitations cold to those whose attendance is critical. It is necessary to provide them with information prior to sending the invitation, so that when the invitation gets to them, they have some idea about what it is about. And in that way, then people will be interested in attending. It is important to note that stakeholders may be both organizations and people. And in an organization, it is necessary to identify the key people to communicate with. The whole organization might be a stakeholder organization, but then there are key people that need to be targeted for communication and for participation in the stakeholder process. So it is important to identify the correct individuals within a stakeholder organization. As part of the workshop preparation process, it is necessary to send invitations to all identified stakeholders. The invitations should be accompanied by some background information on the project. And the background information document, which the different country teams have prepared, should be sent. However, it is not a good idea to send a long document because stakeholders do not have the time to read through that, and a long document can put people off. So it's a good idea to actually summarize the background information document to 3 or 4 pages and to send that out with the invitation. The next part in the process should be the design of the workshop program. Design a realistic program which is not too long. And then it is also important to remember to organize the logistics of the workshop, the venue, the catering, the travel, and other small details. It is a good idea to consider hosting the stakeholder workshop in partnership with a stakeholder organization, such as the high power, high interest stakeholders, because such a stakeholder group already has a wide network which could potentially be drawn to participate in the project. And in some instances, sending out an invitation that is associated with a certain stakeholder group can actually draw other stakeholders to participate. It is important to remember to identify a facilitator for the workshop, someone who will be able to hold the workshop together and keep the participants motivated to participate and give input. What should be covered in the stakeholder workshop? It is essential that the project is introduced and the objectives are spelled out. And it is important to introduce the case study and to summarize the background information that was already sent out. Some people might not have read it, others might not have understood it properly. And it is important to undertake a visioning exercise, and this includes identifying a vision. Although the project at inception would have a vision, it is important to also incorporate the vision that stakeholders would have about a project and the potential change it could bring. It is also important to discuss the constraints to achieving the vision and then to turn these into objectives. Part of the workshop time should be devoted towards understanding who else should be involved in the project. It is important for the stakeholders who are gathered in that workshop to discuss and identify other stakeholders who should be involved in the project, because the stakeholders have a good understanding of the different role players in the particular subject that the project is focusing on. It is important to remember to form a project steering committee or some body that will be responsible for guiding the stakeholder engagement process and to discuss the terms of reference for that steering committee. This steering committee is not the final steering committee for the project, but this should be a preliminary committee that should get the process going. And it is necessary to impress upon the participants that the terms of reference would change when the research program is defined, but it's necessary to have some initial idea. And then part of the process should be devoted towards describing the way forward. What is going to happen after the workshop? What are the expectations for the participants and for the different stakeholders who participate and inform the research process? Following the workshop, it is possible that there may be need to follow up with certain stakeholders, conduct interviews with them, focus group discussions to obtain more information. And that information, together with information that has come out of the first stakeholder workshop, will be important for completion of the causal loop diagrams that the different country teams would have started on. It is important to check against the objectives that the main components of the system have been included in the causal loop diagram. And from the objectives and the causal loop diagram, the next step would be to identify the research questions. And the causal loop diagram will be used for illustrating linkages that are important to understand when addressing any of the objectives of the project. After the workshop, a report on the workshop should be compiled, and this should include the vision of the project, the objectives, the research questions, the steering committee and its terms of reference, and just look at the way forward, the next steps that were agreed to in the workshops. And this report should be circulated to stakeholders, and this should include those that didn't attend the workshop but were identified as key stakeholders to participate in the project. The workshop would have identified the research questions, but it is necessary to validate these research questions with stakeholders after the workshop. It is not necessary, absolutely necessary, to hold a face-to-face meeting with the different stakeholders for purposes of validating the research questions. This can happen through a virtual discussion, but in the workshop, it is necessary to make this point and agree with the stakeholders that the validation will happen through a virtual discussion. And then the researchers then should proceed to draft a research plan. And that research plan should include the research team, and this team should be transdisciplinary and should include specialists from different disciplinary backgrounds. And this should be informed by the objectives of the research and the research questions. And there should be further engagement with selected stakeholders as needed. This is to obtain specific value-based information. And this can be done through interviews and surveys. This is the end of the presentation. Thank you. I hope this information will be useful in your process of planning for your first stakeholder workshop. It is also important to remember that some of the processes or the activities listed do not necessarily have to happen in meetings, but can happen virtually. People can do it through telephone calls, through emails, and the resources, the project resources, should be used to determine what can realistically be achieved and how that stakeholder engagement process should be structured. Thank you.